2, 1.
Welcome to Belfast Pride 2020. As I'm sure you already know, the theme of this year's festival is the Rainbow Heroes and those who have been keeping us all alive on the front line during this terrible pandemic. Usually we would now be all in the Mac Theatre, and instead we're obviously in our own homes, which is lovely, but not as good to not have as much audience interaction. So can you please, any questions that anyone might have, put them onto the Facebook, send them through, and we'll try and get the politicians asked. Anything you can see from when we start introducing ourselves, we do not have the DUP here again. They were asked, and hopefully one day, if we keep torching them and badgering them, they will actually send someone forward. So first of all, I'll go over to Emma. Would you like to introduce yourself and just give a bit of background as what your role is within the party?
Yes, sorry, I was automatically looking for the unmute button there. I've just got used to 3 months of Zoom and you start that straight away. So my name's Emin Sheeran. I'm a Sinn Féin MLA from Mid-Ulster. I'm from South Derry. I'm one of 3 Sinn Féin MLAs in this constituency, and I'm the party's equality spokesperson in the Assembly. So obviously then that means that I'm working with our counterparts in the 26 counties, and we've got a new front bench in terms of spokespeople down there now. I was co-opted into the Assembly in December 2018, and so obviously now we're only 6 months into the new up and formed Assembly, and it's been a learning curve, and I'm really excited to be involved this evening. I was I think third choice. Maria Farrell was supposed to be doing this and had to pull out, and there's a bit of a trend because yesterday I took part in a panel where Mary Ellen Campbell was supposed to be the Sinn Féin rep, and I got asked to do it last minute as well. So
listen, Emma, you'll always be our first choice. So this little group of people that we have gathered here together, we will forever be joined together in the Belfast Pride Zoom talk. I'm going to ask Anthony if you introduce yourself, and I'm not asking in order of superiority or who's a councillor, who's LMLA, or who's a party leader. I'm asking in the order which they appear on the little squares on my screen. So
yeah, sure. Yep, thanks very much, Alison, and thank you, Liam, and everyone at Belfast Pride for inviting me along tonight. So my name's Anthony Flynn, and I'm the Green Party councillor for Ormiston in East Belfast. I was elected in 2019, but I've been a party activist and campaigner for social justice and equality since joining the Green Party in 2014. I'm very proud that my grassroots environmentalist party is led by a feminist, Claire Bailey, MLA, and has this queer as one of its elected representatives. In this 2-minute intro, I've been told I have to tell you what my party's done for queer people and for our liberation, but the caveat to that to remember is that we have not been one of the parties of government for the last 13 years in Northern Ireland. So we brought the first ever LGBTQ motion to the Assembly, which was about supporting equal marriage back in 2012. This was before it had majority popular support, and we took that risk because it was the right thing to do, because it felt right for us as Greens in the belief that everyone should be able to marry the person that they love. We are the only party in the Assembly with a 100% record of voting in favour of this change. We stood Ireland's first ever trans candidate. We have stood more queer candidates than any other of the parties combined, 16 since 2016 and 7 at last year's council elections. And when I say queer candidates, I don't just mean cis white gay men. 2 of our bi women candidates missed out by less than 70 votes last year. We were the first.
I'm sorry, if I'm going to stop you because we're going to move on, and I'm going to come back to this, and you will get a chance to sell me on your all the wonderful.
Didn't give me 2 minutes, so did I?
No, no, but I'm in charge, you say, so it's an alley 2 minutes.
100%.
Doug Biddy, if you go ahead. You're muted.
Hi, got you, Alison. Sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm working off my mobile, so it might be a little bit shaky at times. Doug Beattie, I'm the Ulster Unionist Party MLA for Upper Bann and the Justice spokesperson. I think this is my 3rd Pride Talkback event, and I enjoy it, and I miss us all gathering together in the MAC. But if I remember the last time, it was absolutely sweltering. I remember the sweat tripping me. But it's always a pleasure to be there. The interesting thing for us now, I guess, is that we have now taken on the health portfolio. Healthcare within the LGBT community is a huge issue, and it's something I know that Robin Swan has taken seriously and is looking at in a serious manner. You saw that when he virtually immediately reduced the blood or giving blood ban down to what it is in the rest of the United Kingdom, 3 months, and has continued on with the PrEP review that's been going on since 2018. He's now made that available on the NHS. So there's lots going on, and of course, one of the major things that Robin has done in the health for the Ulster Unionist Party and for everybody is the mental health champion, because we know there's huge issues within the LGBT community in regards to mental health. And one of the tasks of that mental health champion is to identify that. So lots of good work been done, but an awful lot of more work to be done.
No problem. Pete, I'm going to go to you now because yours is the next wee score that I can see.
Yeah, am I unmuted there? You can hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Yeah, I'm Pete Burns. So I'm the SDLP councillor for Sleep William area, which is Newry Mourne Down Council. I'm group leader for the SDLP on Newry Mourne Down Council. I suppose a wee bit of my background, I'll not go into the politics of it because we're going to get to that. I didn't grow up in politics. I'm relatively new to politics, involved in it in about 4 years. So I run a family headstone business here in Crossmaglen inside Armagh, and I'm also a maths teacher. And I suppose with my community activism, I managed a soccer team in Crossmaglen for nearly a decade and worked with youth clubs. So I suppose when I met my husband, now husband, back in 2006, it changed absolutely everything for me, because it threw a quiet person into the spotlight when I didn't ask for it, in a rural community where it was like a needle in a haystack. So I used my voice to speak out and help others, and that's where the political activism then started. So when I got involved then in politics, I suppose I'm learning as much from these events, being involved in them, from the people that ask questions, learning myself, and it's helping me to represent the community and the LGBT community a lot better. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak again tonight, and look forward to the questions coming in.
No problem. Naomi, you're obviously a veteran of the Pride Talks back as well.
Thanks very much. I was just about to say I'm not one of the new faces. I'm an old face, so apologies for that. Maybe I don't need mute. Maybe I should just be without video. But I'm really pleased to be here again. I mean, I always enjoy Pride Talks back. I've been doing it for a long time, right from the days when it was quite a small event to the more recent times in the MAC. So it's good to be able to do it here from the comfort of my own home. But you do miss the contact, I think, and this year's Pride is going to be a bit of a strange one, in that it is going to be socially distanced, but that's the space we're in at the minute. It's also a good one, I suppose, because there are things to celebrate. There have been improvements in the last couple of years, and there are positives, things like equal marriage coming forward, and so on. It is really good news, I think, for the community more widely. However, I still think that there's a lot of work to be done. For example, how you convert your civil partnership, if you want to, into a marriage hasn't yet gone through. We need to get that sorted. And I think that there are also other challenges, the Gender Recognition Act, access to healthcare for the LGBTQ community, and then I think a general lack of funding for organisations, which has been a perennial complaint, and one which I think, despite a lot of engagement over the years, has never really been fully resolved by the departments who are in charge of funding organisations. So I think that there's something there that the executive can and should act on, and it's something that I want to press for in my role as Justice Minister. I think there are also opportunities within that role to continue the good work that the Department of Justice has been doing. So I want to get to work on things like the hate crime legislation, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Judge Marinan brings forward towards the end of this year in terms of reviewing the legislation we have in place and what changes need to be made, because I think that's something that can be really impactful in people's lives. But beyond just my own department, I'm also wanting to look at things like education and why young people who are LGBTQ end up being underserved by the education system, and also why teachers often feel fully about coming out about their own sexuality in the workplace. And that's something that we need to deal with, as well as doing other things that I think are cross-cutting. So, I mean, Doug's right. I mean, Robin was quick to act around the blood ban. Now I want to talk to Robin and to talk to Karen McKillen about things like banning conversion therapy, because I think there's a window of opportunity to do those things in this term, despite all the other challenges we face. But I think it's not just about looking at how.
I'm going to stop you too, Naomi, because
no problem.
To Fiona, we'll come back and we'll all get a chance to talk later. To Fiona. So Fiona, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Alison. I'm obviously here on behalf of People Before Profit, who I have been an activist with for about 6 or 7 years now. I can't remember exactly which. And I was elected as a councillor for the party in 2019 for the North Belfast area. I am a proud socialist, a proud feminist, and I think it's fair to say I've always been a strong and a proud supporter of LGBTQ plus rights. This is my second Pride Talks back, and I do think it is a bit of a shame that we're not in the MAC, just because I think audience participation in this kind of thing is so important. But I hope that people at home can use the opportunity, that you don't have to get into the limited seating, and that anybody can tune in, anybody can watch and put questions to politicians about the state of LGBTQ plus rights, stigma, oppression, and the kind of problems that we still have in that area. That being said, I'm probably going to slightly differ from the rest of the panel in the sense that I don't think that we should sit back and wait for politicians like those of us here on this panel to make the kind of changes that we need to see for the LGBTQ plus community. I think we need to take inspiration from the first Pride, and get involved in protest, campaigning, solidarity action, and standing with other groups like women and minorities in order to fight for liberation. Because I think if we continue to wait, we'll be waiting a long, long time.
I'm going to go to Emma with the first question. We have had change from the last time I did stand in the MAC, and Doug says, in that terrible heat. And I always say they don't pay me for doing this, but they do give me vodka. But I get the same amount of vodka whether or not I show up to MAC or not. So it's dead on. So apparently, according to Liam, he's still going to pay me in bottles of vodka. What kind of job would you not do for that? Emma, in relation to the Westminster legislation, obviously things have changed. We've had the first same-sex marriages have taken place here, but the bill itself is, again, it's not fit for purpose if you look at what else exists in these other parts of these islands. So if you have a civil partnership, if you live anywhere else in Scotland, England or Wales, you can convert that for the princely sum of 45 quid. Here you can't, and people are having to go through other second ceremonies or jump through loops. So there's things like that have to change. And also in the relation to people who want to have faith marriages, and we know that there are plenty of people who have already said they will conduct those faith marriages, but the legislation still falls short. And I'm minded that at the very start of the pandemic, when we were doing the daily executive briefings, that Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill stood side by side and said they had changed the regulations to allow people who were terminally ill to marry, because it was unfair to withhold that from that. And I was minded that only applied to heterosexual marriages. It wouldn't have applied to anyone of a same-sex marriage who maybe wanted to convert their civil partnership or have someone of faith and a minister to come in and marry them at the end of their days, which seemed very cruel. What is your party going to do to ensure that the secondary legislation that's needed to change that, and to change that bill to make it that it is exactly even, that people here have exactly the same rights as they do in any other part of these islands?
Well, I think from our perspective, obviously Sinn Féin are consistent in that we obviously support, we're a party of equality, we're a Republican Party, and you can't have full equality unless everyone is equal. And so this is one of the issues with the Assembly and with the system of government that we have, that we share power with the DUP, who are opposed to a lot of these sorts of rights and to freedom and equality, particularly for the LGBT community. So one of the issues, like the only reason that we had Westminster legislation to bring forward marriage equality was because it had been blocked using the veto in the past, and obviously there were numerous votes on marriage equality long before I was in the Assembly, where there was widespread support for it. We've seen support across the board, and I do believe that within political unionism, the vast majority of DUP voters are not aligned with their party on social issues and aren't aligned with them on the issue of marriage equality or issues of greater rights for people from the LGBTQI plus community. So for us, it's a battle, and it's something that we're committed to, but it's not going to be straightforward because we're sharing power with people that don't agree with us on that instance. Marriage equality was obviously the big figurehead of the campaign, and people could say, oh, we've achieved that now, that's it, that box is ticked, people can get married, they can marry who they want to. But the conversation that I was part of yesterday, it doesn't stop with that. Once you achieve one right, you don't just fix the problem overnight. So, you know, if you draw the comparisons between what's happening in America now and what's happened over the past couple of months and the issues with Black Lives Matter, you're 150 years post abolition of slavery, 50 years post the end of Jim Crow and supposed equality, yet you still have systematic racism, you still have discrimination within institutions. And so unless we have a proper system of education, of speaking to people, of bringing those views out into the open and sort of discussing with people what is stopping you from going across this line, then you're not going to have full equality. So I think even the fact that the DUP won't take part tonight, you know, if we could have representatives from the party or activists who would discuss out what their fears and concerns are, or why they're reluctant to sign off on something like that, you'd maybe be able to make some progress. But from our party's perspective, we're committed to the things that you're talking about there that are simple. If you live in the 26th or you live in the UK and aren't here, it's not good enough.
Naomi, I'm going to go to you actually in the executive. I mean, the very small legislative changes that are needed to allow people to convert their civil partnership into a marriage, or to allow people of faith to have a faith-based marriage. What needs to be done first of all within the executive? Is that actually being progressed? Is there even talk of that, or has that just sort of been grounded in the middle of everything else that's been going on?
No, it hasn't been grounded. I actually met with Conor Murphy a few weeks ago to discuss with him some gaps in marriage legislation. So it's not just LGBTQ people who will struggle with their marriages. I mean, we also have a gap there with humanist marriages, which aren't given recognition, which was the intention of the law as well at the time. And so we met just a couple of weeks ago to discuss what opportunities there would be to bring forward the legislation that's required this term. It's not big legislation, it's not complex. It doesn't interfere with anybody's human rights in terms of religion and so on, because it's an opt-in process. And so there's no challenge around that. So I don't think it's something we can't do. I mean, yes, COVID-19 has consumed a lot of our time. There's no question about that. It is also, we know a lot of our time will be consumed as we prepare for Brexit at the end of the year. But that doesn't mean we have no bandwidth to do other things. I mean, I'm cracking on with the domestic abuse legislation, and I mean, I think in total 4 bills, which I'm hoping to bring forward this year, and Doug will be kept busy on the committee scrutinising all of those. But there's a lot of legislation and there's a lot of stuff that can be done in addition to the work we're doing around COVID. And I don't think that that's an excuse not to do what is required at the Assembly. And I also am not so sure that when it's brought forward, and we're talking here about what are minor amendments to the current legislation, that it will necessarily meet significant resistance in the executive. There will be some people who are diametrically opposed to this, and that's fine. But I don't see it being something that we're going to have a huge amount of difficulty convincing people to go with, because I think at the end of the day, it's the natural extension of what has already been agreed, what has already been passed, and I don't see why anyone would want to stand in the way. But I know that if Conor brings forward legislation to do this, he'll have my party's support to get it done.
Pete, I'm going to go to you now, because in relation to your own party, there is obviously there's still a lot of the social issues that they're still allowing a conscience clause within the SDLP, and we have seen some resignations of councillors who have said that they're standing down because are going independent because they're opposed to change on a number of social issues. Is the party united on this, or is there opposition in some ways to be allowing faith-based marriages or any of the other changes that need to happen?
Well, inside our party, we allow healthy debate. Sometimes it's very, very unhealthy, and I'll say, behind closed doors, I've got very irate at certain times over certain issues, finding myself in a position where I'm in a civil partnership. So we're talking about my scenario here of trying to upgrade to full marriage. I agree with Naomi. Before I come back to that point, I agree with Naomi that is very small changes. There isn't real resistance to it. It is the natural progression from the marriage equality legislation that was passed. And when I'm speaking, and I've been speaking to people across party and council, and that's with members of the DUP as well, there isn't, if any, resistance to this extension of allowing civil partnerships to be upgraded to full marriage. There is a bit of debate among parties, DUP and some people in our party, of when you start talking about faith-based. I myself don't sign up to any faith, but my husband does, he's incredibly religious, and his family is. So we've been arguing about, when it does come to the point he would love to have that as an option. I'm not too bothered on it. But yeah, I think that will come. I can't see, we can't allow COVID and Brexit to become sort of barriers to progressing these issues and these simple issues. When you're talking about people leaving from the party and social issues, you get a few excuses thrown out in the public, and I read some of them, and I don't agree because I'm on the inside. We do have a lot of different opinions. We do have, and I think it's healthy. And when I got involved 4 years ago, made it my business to sit down with people that have different opinions. And I've done that across my family before I even got married, in my immediate family. I'd say, listen, I'm not going to come at you hammer and tongs, but I want to discuss the issues with you as two grown-ups. And I find that, for me, a good way forward with party colleagues, with family, with people in my community. And I bank the small wins and we build on that. So I think that's the best way of going forward. It did start when I first got involved in politics, of lifting the chair and throwing it when people disagreed with me and said that, you know, they weren't ready for equality, me to have the same equality as others. But going forward, I think we need to sit and engage and listen to people that have different opinions, find out why. And usually, and I'll finish on this point, usually when I sit down and discuss this with people, you realize it's just a miscommunication. They don't usually understand. Or you get this line, when it comes to your family, you'll start to engage and realize, as if it's, you know, some disease when it comes to your family. But you get that line trotted out. Whenever people are faced with these discussions, they're pretty engaging and you can move forward together.
Doug, I suppose the perception of these things is that the resistance from change almost always comes from within unionism. Within your own party, obviously, there's been a lot of debate, and a lot of people have been on a journey themselves and come around and changed their views on many subjects, probably your party leader being one of them, if we look back into the past. So, I mean, in relation to what you will be doing and what your party will be doing to progress what's needed to get this legislation up to speed with where it is everywhere else, do you think that there will be a uniformness of that, or do you think that there will still remain opposition within, I know you can't speak for the DUP, but from within your section of unionism?
I think there's a huge.
Sorry, Kate, I was talking to Doug there.
Oh, sorry.
You're okay.
Sorry, Alison, I got that question. I mean, it's interesting, I've got to say, Alison, because, I mean, as an Ulster Unionist, I wanted to pass a legislation for same-sex marriage in our assembly. I wanted to be part of that, and that wasn't going to be the case, and it was passed in Westminster. And in many ways, it has taken the heat out of the debate. The heat has maybe gone out of that part of the debate about same-sex marriage, even whether it's religious same-sex marriage or not. The heat's not really there anymore, although the debate is still absolutely there, and it's absolutely there within unionism at every single level. Within the MLA group, you know, the same people are still there, still arguing against it, because their background, a very religious background, and they take the scripture to its natural conclusion as far as they're concerned. You know, so that debate is always there, but that debate has always been a good debate. It's always been a healthy debate in many ways. But what's gone is the heat is now out of that debate. It's there. The heat is now shifted on to other debates. So like the debate on reproductive rights is now the one where there's more heat on it. So I guess, you know, we still need to have conversations every time there's going to be any form of a change to the present legislation which was passed at Westminster, whether that's converting civil partnerships. There will be a conversation that needs to be had within unionism and within the Ulster Unionist Party, and same for religious marriages as well, same-sex religious marriages. We'll have that same conversation, and people will give across their point of view. But there's no heat in it anymore. I don't sense any more heat within that. It's nearly a pragmatic approach to the whole thing. And I say this to my colleagues, and I say this to all unionists. We've got absolutely nothing to fear from same-sex marriage and equality and rights for the LGBT community. Quite the opposite. You know, we need to be reaching out to them, and need to be reaching out to them far more than we are at present. But I think, you know, as far as the Ulster Unionist Party is concerned, you know, we will not remove the conscience vote. That's going to stay there. We allow that. But I think there's a healthy debate, but certainly no heat in it anymore.
I'm going to ask Anthony and Fiona both the same question, give you a chance to answer it. As two of the smaller parties within the Assembly, what can your party assembly members do to try and put pressure on to make sure that this doesn't fall off the agenda at a time, obviously, when pushing many of the decisions aside? So Anthony, I'm going to start with you, and I know that your party leader is very active on this, but what difference can a party as small, with such a small representation in the executive, make when it comes to pushing forward what's needed just to finish off this legislation and ensure it's fit for purpose?
Yeah, well, I think keeping the issue on the agenda is first and foremost probably one of the most important things that we can do. And debates such as this, where we can openly discuss these issues and put members of the executive parties on the burner to make sure that they actually deliver on what they've said that they're going to deliver. I think it's important to remember that the DUP don't hold a majority on the executive. So as far as they're concerned, they can't block these changes, from what I can see anyway, unless members of the executive parties wish to clarify me on that. But it's important to remember that when these legislative changes were made in February of this year, it wasn't just marriage that was made; it was also abortion rights as well, abortion decriminalisation. And what we've seen around that period of time was the Conservatives almost immediately completely changed their entire viewpoint and what they were fighting against, from marriage on to trying to block women and pregnant people from bodily autonomy. And I agree with a lot of what others have said, and that there isn't a huge drive against this anymore. And that's essentially what we can do to ensure that it's kept on the agenda. And again, like evenings like tonight.
Yeah, Fiona, for yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I think it's a good way to frame the question: what can smaller parties do in the Assembly? Because things, I think it's fair to say, have been made more difficult in recent years for smaller parties on the Assembly. When Claire Bailey, who you just mentioned, and Jerry Carroll and Eamon McCann at the time were first elected, the kind of speaking time rules were changed so that smaller parties had less of a voice. It's very difficult for smaller parties to even put as much as a motion on the agenda, and some of that is quite purposeful. The ability is there to change it, but it's not done, and the smaller parties can't do that. For us, though, the ability to change what's happening in Stormont is there, has long been there, and is not being utilised. And as Anto just said, the DUP do not hold a majority, and there are other parties, I think, who have been in the executive with the DUP for too long on questioning of the fact that we don't have those kind of rights in the north. Some might dispute that, but I think that that's fair to say. As far as we're concerned, a people before profit, getting elected to places like the Assembly as a smaller party, especially as a socialist party who doesn't necessarily believe that the Assembly will wholesale change things in terms of the better for the liberation of groups like LGBTQ people. For us, we get elected to the Assembly so that we can use that platform as a voice, to give voice to campaigns on the ground. And let's be quite frank, we wouldn't have marriage equality, nor will we have abortion rights without campaigns on the ground in this space. It's ever been that way. It will ever be that way. So what we want to do is use the seats that we have, use whatever time we can get, but most of all, use the platform that we have to say, yes, small legislative changes are fine. Yes, they're easy to do, but we need to go much further than that. We need to talk about liberation. We need to talk about ending oppression. And we need to talk about the way that things like stigma against the LGBTQ plus community in this space is often, and far too often, propagated from those at the top of society. And I mean that talking about not just politicians, but the way these kind of discourse matters are allowed to play out in the media.
Alison, just on what's on what's been said. I mean, it's true the DUP don't have a majority either in the Assembly or in the executive, but they actually can't block things, so nobody should be under any illusions about that. I mean, if Conor Murphy brings a paper to change marriage equality, 3 DUP ministers can petition against it and stop that bill going forward. So it is possible for them to stop things happening. They're also capable of stopping things getting on the agenda, as are Sinn Féin. So there is a block and a veto mechanism there. And again, there is in the chamber, and they may not have enough people in their own party to do it, but them plus Jim Allister and a couple of others is all it takes to be able to get these blockages over the line. So I wouldn't underestimate the influence that them going against things could have. I think that'd be the wrong thing to do. But I'm not so sure actually that they would meet the kind of resistance the previous changes have. This is not a root and branch reform or a root and branch change, which I think that they would have resisted tooth and nail to the end. This is about aligning things, I think tidying up the legislation in quite an important way for people who are affected by it. But actually, in terms of the principal objections, it doesn't make a substantive difference. So I think there may be more opportunity for people to be able to move. And the other thing I would say to Fiona is that I was in the Assembly when, you know, speaking rights in a smaller party. Things are much better now. You do get called more frequently as an independent or as a member of a smaller party. It used to be only on to hunt. So things are actually better than they were, believe it or not. Hard to believe, I know, given how
indeed
it is, but that's the truth of it. It's better now than it was, but it's slow progress, and we're certainly supportive of making sure that as many different voices in the Assembly are heard, because I actually believe that equality isn't just about ticking boxes in terms of who's included. It's also about making sure that as diverse a range of voices are heard when we're making the decisions. It's not just about preventing discrimination against people. It's about actively looking to see what we can do proactively to ensure that people can actually fulfill their potential. And I think everybody has to be part of that, including those who are outside the executive and those who are in smaller parties, because I think they have a vital role to play in actually challenging.
That actually leads me on to where I was going next. In relation to representation within political parties of people from the LGBTQ community, you know, we've had a debate for many years in relation to female representation, and we now have a situation where we have, you know, I think it's, 4 female party leaders within the Assembly, one of them who is with us now. But the task now has to move on to representation of all people, and I think that, you know, that includes people who have now made this place their home, who are completely unrepresented within politics, and also people from other minority groups. I mean, we have what is a pretty unrepresentative group here, because we obviously have Pete and we have Anthony, and that gives the impression that there's equality across all the parties. But I do think, you know, as a woman, I would have said it's no point just having somebody, you have to see it to know you can be it. So there's no point in parties putting people forward to say this ticks the box and we have, you know, this amount of people from the LGBT community standing for us, unless those people are being put forward, and unless those people are being put forward for interviews, unless those people are being platformed and given opportunities for promotion. Well, then is it just become a box ticking exercise? I'm going to go to Emma in relation to that and see what exactly are Sinn Féin doing in order to make sure that their party representation is not just gender proofed and gender equal, but also equal in terms of LGBTQ. And are you actively trying to encourage people who have now came here and have made this place their home and are adding to our community? We're talking about the Rainbow Heroes. We know how many of those NHS heroes who have came here and thankfully made this their home and helped keep us all alive during this time. But we don't see those people in politics, and we don't see them represented within political parties.
Yeah, well, you touched there on female representation, and I suppose that's maybe the first challenge for us as a party. We have gender quotas, but we're still not 50-50 in terms of female representation at all levels. So within the Assembly, I actually think we have more women MLAs than we do men, but that isn't reflected across the board in terms of council or Westminster team, even within our TDs and our Shanadori. But it's something obviously that the party have actively worked towards. We've got a strategy in terms of electoral politics. We have gender quotas in place, and we try to encourage selection of female candidates where possible. Then in terms of what you're talking about, we don't have a strategy per se. We don't have the same sort of threshold for LGBT plus people. We do have representatives who identify as part of that community, some who are open about it and some who are not. But obviously, as a party of equality, we would encourage, you know, Sinn Féin is a broad church, and we have people from all backgrounds within our membership. And when we're selecting candidates, if someone comes from a minority community and is willing to stand for us, that would be something that would add a feather to their bow, as opposed to omit them or exclude them from selection. So it's something that, in terms of like selecting people from LGBT LGBTQI plus communities we have to actively work on. But we're obviously, we have a LGBT branch, and members within that are active in the party. And obviously, because we're a democratic party, and every policy decision that we take is decided upon at the floor of an Ardèche, there's room for every voice within the party, and the LGBT group within the party are very active and well known.
Okay, Anthony, I'm going to go to you in relation to that. I mean, obviously, the Green Party, you would say, has a good track record in relation to standing candidates, but it's also making those people very visible, isn't it? Making sure that their voices are heard and that they're not just put there as a paper candidate to tick a box.
Absolutely, Alison. I mean, it's vitally important that, as you say, we don't just put people forward in terms of ticking a box. It's that we actually put them in winnable seats, and seats that they can return a strong vote and get a seat in. And you know, like I said in my introduction, you know, we had 2 out by women at the council elections last year who just missed out narrowly in their respective areas. You know, the Green Party have been, you know, quite good on this. You know, we have 40% at the minute elected representatives in terms of female gender balance, and we also have quotas that we use within the party as well. Our quotas at the minute are 33% female candidates for all of our elections that we fight, and we've always exceeded that because it's always been quite an easy bar for us to succeed in. And for the past couple of assembly elections, we've always hit 50-50%. But I think, you know, a part of that is a reason, or a part of that whole mentality comes from the fact that we're an all-island party, and you know, gender quotas are they're enforced in the Republic of Ireland, and that has filtered up through. I think Sinn Féin would be the same in that, and people for profit as well. In terms of other minority groups, I mean, yeah, we did stand the first trans candidate on the island of Ireland with Ellen Murray for the past couple of election cycles. Unfortunately, she hasn't been elected yet for us, but you know, minority groups as well. We need to do much more. I know as a party, as any party, again, you know, we're looking around the balance here, and we're just all white faces. I sit in the Assembly chamber, and we're all white faces as well. We're in the Council chamber. And so there's quite a lot that all parties, I think, can do to try and encourage and actively encourage people within their parties to come forward. You know, as a member of a political party, we're constantly putting out calls for people to want to get involved and want to maybe put themselves forward for candidates for whatever seats and all the rest of it. And 9 times out of 10, it's always men that come forward first. And I, you know, have to actively go to some of the women, really good women activists I know within my party to say, any chance, have you ever thought about running? You know, it's those sorts of conversations that I find, you know, we've always had to keep going back and asking women, because women face particular barriers. We know within the past 12 months, actually being elected in the council, I've firsthand seen the type of barriers that women face. I know some of my council colleagues have had issues around childcare, for example, and maternity leave. So some of those issues really need to be addressed as well in terms of barriers.
Doug, and I'll say the same to you, you know, is there any sort of move within your party? Because, I mean, Anthony's right, when you ask for people to step forward, you know, that men step forward for jobs they're underqualified to do, and women don't come forward till they're overqualified to do it. But in trying to attract people from all different kinds of walks of life, you know, I go and give talks in secondary schools, or at least I did when secondary schools used to go to school. And you could see, when you go into any school now, anywhere across Belfast specifically, you will see children who come from all kinds of backgrounds. But they're not reflective. They don't see anyone who reflects them within politics at all. Is your party doing anything to attract people, not just from the LGBTQ community, but also to attract people from other minority backgrounds as well? And more importantly, when we do get candidates like that they're put forward, you know that the DUP had Alison Bennington elected as first openly gay councillor, but she doesn't speak to media, she doesn't give interviews, and therefore she's not visible. You know, she's not visible as a person or as a representation of a unionist from that background. Do you think that unionism finds it very difficult to get people who want to speak about their personal life in that respect? And is that where the problem is in getting physical representation?
I think there's a number of questions in that, Alison, and if I can maybe just unpack a couple of them. First of all, diversity within the Ulster Unionist Party is a real issue. We did have a strategy to try and get more females to come forward to stand for election. We managed to get more females to come forward to stand for election. That doesn't mean we managed to get them elected, but they certainly came forward. So we certainly increased that. And if I'm really honest, that's the the mainstay of where we are now, trying to get that gender balance right, because we haven't got that right clearly with 10 MLAs and only one of them is a female, and not enough female councillors either. So, you know, there's an issue there, and of course we need to reach out to minority groups also, to see if we can get to bring them in, because we want to be representative of the whole of society here in Northern Ireland. And you're absolutely right. It's a piece of work that we have to get on with, and behind the scenes, Steve Aiken, their party leader, is working on those very issues. In regards to the LGBTQ community, you know as well as I do, we've an uphill struggle, and our uphill struggle is because many people look at unionists and unionist parties, and certainly the two main unionist parties, and they think we are a cold house for the LGBTQ community, and part of that is because of what the DUP has done in the past, and of course the Ulster Unionist Party. We haven't been as open as we should have been, but some of the things that the DUP did in the past has not made unionists welcoming. I mean, the fact that they're not here means that they are basically saying that there's a section of our community who they don't feel they need to speak to. But we're trying to speak, and we're trying to get that message out that we're not the same as them. We are trying to reach out. We are climbing that hill, and we want the LGBT community to say it's okay to be a unionist and LGBTQ. And that's just a fight that we've got. And I've said this, I think, on every occasion that I've come to Pride Talkback and say we are fighting an uphill struggle. And we continue to fight that uphill struggle as long as people view all unionism as one homogenous group, and we're not. We are not the same.
Before I had asked that question, when I look at the public questions, we have a question from Michael Palmer, who is a gay Ulster Unionist Party member, who is asking exactly the same questions. How will your party encourage more LGBT people to get involved in elected politics? So there is evidence that at least a member of your party who identifies as gay has shown up to ask a question at this conference. Naomi, with yourselves, because you're not necessarily, you're a party that doesn't identify as unionist or nationalist, so that's not what's holding back members of other minority communities coming forward and standing. As a party leader, you need not just to find those people to stand them in election, but also make sure that they're put into seats where they have a chance of actually winning those seats. And then if they do win those seats, make sure that they have a platform and a voice, and that they are put forward when people like me come along looking for someone to interview, and not just put forward to answer questions about that specific subject. I think that the problem is that, when people started putting women into politics, they put them forward to talk about childcare and didn't put them forward to talk about security or, crime or any of those sort of things. And the same thing could be said when you have a political party that has an openly gay member. They can't just be seen to be rolling them out to talk about that issue. They have to be put forward as a rounded person to talk about every issue that's on the agenda.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really important, because childcare isn't an issue for me. I don't have children, but it is an issue for some of my male colleagues who do. So I think it's really important that we don't stereotype those issues, and we actually look much wider at these as parental responsibilities rather than women's responsibilities. Although we know from the recent lockdown and COVID, women are disproportionately affected, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But we shouldn't talk about it in policy terms, as though it's a woman's job. But yeah, we do need to increase diversity. It's something I'm very conscious of in the party. Yes, we did well. We had Anna Lowe elected to the Assembly. It was the first time any ethnic Chinese person had been elected to a legislature anywhere in Europe. That was not just a first for Alliance, it was actually a first for Northern Ireland to be leading the way on something like that. But the Chinese community have been living in Northern Ireland since the 60s and 70s and are very much part of the fabric of society. Whereas I think more recent newcomers to Northern Ireland may not necessarily feel as comfortable. And it takes a long time, I think, for people to engage in the politics in a new space, unless there's something that's directly impacting on them, which is why campaigns and so on are really engaging for people. When it comes to the LGBTQ community, we have over 40% of our Assembly team who identify as gay, so there's not an issue there. We would have similar proportions when it comes to local government. We have a significant number of LGBTQ people in our Assembly or in our council teams, and it's not that we put them forward as, if you like, spokespeople for gay issues, because that's not how I see them. I mean, when Anna was in the Assembly, she was our environment chair, and what she did around the environment and environmental legislation and scrutiny was the thing that set her apart, not the fact that she had a Chinese ethnic background. And I think it's really important that we don't pigeonhole people. So, you know, when Andrew Muir or John Blair are up speaking in the Assembly, they're not there up speaking as a gay person. They're there speaking as a representative of Alliance, whether it's about agriculture or infrastructure or the economy or whatever it is. But it's important that there are people like them in the Assembly speaking up on those issues, because they're as relevant to people from the LGBTQ community as anyone else in society, and it's important their voices are heard. I mean, we have, again, over 40% of our reps are women, and in the recent elections, you know, we had 50% of our candidates were women, and that came about naturally. We don't have quotas in Alliance, but we do have affirmative action, and we currently have a diversity action group which is working through areas where we feel we could do better. Because for me, this isn't about resting on our laurels and saying, well, look, we've got some things right in the past and that's great. It's about saying, where do we go next? How do we move forward? How do we make the party more inclusive? Because ultimately, my vision for Northern Ireland is one that brings people together from a whole diverse range of backgrounds. That's what I want to see. So if we're going to live up to that, we have to see it represented in the people who are elected. And it's important to me that happens. We almost did actually have quite a significant person from the ethnic minority community elected to council on this occasion. And unfortunately, it was to do with technicalities around nationality and membership of the Commonwealth and all sorts of other nonsense that supersedes somebody's residency here when they come to stand for council. And I think that there are things there that could be done to make it easier for people who live in Northern Ireland, who run businesses here, who are invested in our community. Instead of putting barriers up to say you have to be a citizen of a Commonwealth country or you have to be an EU citizen or whatever, why not base it on people's engagement in society here? Because I think if you're engaged in this community, you've got a right to represent it. And I don't think we should be putting unnecessary barriers in people's way. And in that occasion, the lady who was going to stand would have won the seat because actually the person who replaced her did. So it's a real shame that we didn't get that opportunity. But I think we've got to work through those issues and make it easier for people to come forward and encourage and support them to believe that their voices matter. Because I think sometimes, because the only people they see discussing politics are people who look like us, then I think perhaps they don't realise that their voices are just as valuable.
Exactly. Pete, I'm going to ask you the same question. What are the SDLP doing, do you think, to encourage other people from minority backgrounds, other people from the LGBTQ community, but also other people from other minority backgrounds across the north to stand in election and to promote people from other backgrounds to stand in election?
Well, over the last couple of years, I had a lot of work. I suppose I'm one of the fruits of that work, in the sense that since Colin Eastwood took over as leader of the party, he's actively got into, you know, to try and increase the representation of women and those from minority backgrounds, myself included. I mean, he came down to Crossford the night that I was selected to give a talk on it. I found when I got involved, I said this at the start, I wasn't involved in politics, although I always had an interest in politics. I was never involved in any political party. I was involved in the community work among South Armagh, Crossford End with the football team and that. But when I got involved in politics, I stepped into the chamber and I seen the 41 councillors in Newry Mourne Down District Council, and I completely agree with some of the speakers beforehand. I thought this does not represent the community that I live in. And you're right, it was all white faces. There was the increase in women in Newry Mourne Down is huge now over the last couple of years. But I mean, I was the only person from the LGBT community that was there, and I felt at the start it was out of my depth. But then when you realise that everybody's sort of blagging it in there, that you're there to represent people in your own community, I realised that when I spoke on issues of LGBT nature, that it garnered a lot more respect across the chamber. People were willing to engage and talk, and that sort of was the light bulb moment for me, because it's like going travelling. When you meet people from different backgrounds, when you listen, when you work with them, you start to learn and grow as a person. And I think it only helps for local democracy, local government, central government, if we have a chamber that is reflective of the place that it's meant to be representing. And I think we're slowly getting there. In the last term, and I know it was a deputy mayor, outgoing Sinn Féin deputy mayor from Eastern European deputy mayor, and we need more of that. We need people from all minority backgrounds. Yes, in terms of women, I mean, we need to find some strong men in our party. I mean, the women are ruling it in our party. You know, Claire, Hannah and Nicola, Cara Hunter, the new MLA, Laura Devlin, our chair of Newry Mourne Down Council. But we, through the district executive, down to constituency council, down to the branches, and I'm extremely active in all those forums, go out and actively try and recruit people from the LGBT community. The team that work around me are all, LGBT community, because that's, the people that I feel comfortable working in and around. So I think we've got strong people out there, but this is a really, really important point. I think politics needs to be attractive too. When you get involved, the amount of abuse you get coming from one of these communities is toxic in Northern Ireland. I mean, even, over the last couple of weeks, as the debate, I would probably get to it, as the debate on gender recognition and down the south was gathering legs, and there was protests on the street. I mean, the abusive message, you just get picked out by people on Twitter, on Facebook, whatever, mostly Twitter, that feel as if you can be just ripped to shreds and attacked. And see, when I speak to people in the community, LGBT community, to get involved in politics and say how much I've got out of it, they always reference that. They always reference, I don't want to take all that nonsense, and I don't want that all to come in my family. So we have a lot of tidying up to do to make it a lot more attractive. I agree that when I first got involved, I was saying, and I said this to Colin, do not just put me out there when we're talking about LGBT issues. And the first time that I was out on a party broadcast, it was obviously talking about being married. But I felt that was my choice, and I felt it was important to do that. The party has put me forward on a number of debates and TV shows to talk about other issues, because I'm a lot more than that. I always refer to myself as, that's only 1 or 2% of me is my sexuality. I mean, 50% of me is a Liverpool fan, so there's a lot more to me than my sexuality. But no, over the last couple of years, Colin's done an amazing job to reach into different communities and to ask us to come forward. We've an awful lot of tidying up to do to get people to actually stand up and get involved in open politics.
Fiona, same question to you. It is a difficult one, because as Pete said, we know, and we live in a social media age, and as anyone who has a public profile knows that, that can be great, because it means you have an instant platform to speak to people, but it also means that you're subject to instant abuse from people who have anonymity in terms of trying to recruit people into your party. And I know that yourself and Jerry and the rest of them have been quite outspoken about the Black Lives Matter protests and the fines at that. But we could see at those protests the diverse nature of this place that we live in, and we do not see that represented in politics at all.
Absolutely. And I think for a long time, there was the notion that was accepted that, well, there aren't as many LGBTQ people as there are straight people, or there aren't as many minorities, therefore that's why we don't see it reflected. And actually, I think that the reasons are far more difficult than that for people who are in that position. And absolutely, social media can be a horrible place to be at times. It's very useful for us as politicians. It can be a horrible place. And I think, someone like Naomi, who's here tonight, can speak to that in particular, and in particular, women who have any sort of profile with open messages. And I know yourself, Alison, can absolutely speak to how difficult social media is for women. And I think that, it's not just social media, it's face-to-face interactions. It's the stigma that exists everywhere in society. So, as an organization who has proudly stood up for women, for the LGBTQ plus community, for migrants, as you say, who play a part in organizing or facilitating these kind of protests, we don't have any lack of opportunity to meet these kind of people, to ask them to join people before profit, and to have them come into the organization. It's an entirely different thing getting people from the LGBTQ plus community, women, especially working class women, who are the majority of women who join people before profit, and migrants or asylum seekers to run for election, because of those barriers, because of that stigma, whether it's childcare, whether it's the fact that working class people struggle to put themselves forward in these platforms, or whether it's, and Naomi kind of touched on it, the inability of asylum seekers and other migrants, the kind of people who we're talking about as rainbow heroes, who should be in the assembly when we're talking about stuff like pay for healthcare workers, and the fact that they still haven't got the payback for the strike action that they took at the beginning of this year, and they're still having to wait. We need to see more people in there, but there are systemic barriers that exist that prevent those people from taking those positions as easily as other people. I want to say something that maybe hasn't been said yet, and is maybe slightly controversial on that point. And I've said it before, and I don't hold back from saying it, which is that we absolutely need diversity in these places. And I use the women, the example of women in politics in particular. We don't just need to, believe in and make happen that statement, that slogan, nothing about us without us. But we also need to make sure that the people that we're putting into elected politics will stand by us. I don't care if we have another Margaret Thatcher, another Theresa May, another Priti Patel, another LGBT member of the DUP who will not go in and vote for people's rights when they're on the table in front of them. We need to see people who not only represent those minorities, but also people who will go in and stand up and champion those kind of groups and vote for their rights.
My daughters get T-shirts every Christmas from Mrs. Claus because Santa doesn't come to our house because why would some man get the credit for my work all year? But and one of their T-shirts this year said nothing about us without us. T-shirt, and it is true because as a young woman, if you don't see it, how do you know you can be it? And and I always say that we're going to go to some of the audience questions now, our audience as in a virtual audience now, and not people raising their hand within the Mac Theatre. This is from Lauren Allison, and she has said to the panel, where does your party stand on conversion therapy? If against it, how do you plan combating conversion therapy in Northern Ireland? And I think that that's something that has appeared again and again, year after year. I know that I have been writing about that in the past, and you would have thought that we were at a space where it no longer existed, but we know that it is still very prevalent, and there is still people out there practicing this and passing it off as a genuine science. I suppose, Naomi, as Justice Minister, you're probably the person who has the power to do something about this. Is this something that you have been looking at?
Well, it's one of those things, Alison, and people get frustrated with me, but actually my powers are relatively limited. I can certainly legislate to ban conversion therapy, but the policy lead comes from the Department for Communities and the Department for Health. I've written to them both to ask them whether or not they would be up for taking forward legislation to ban it, because if so, it is possible that we can include that within the miscellaneous provisions of the Justice Bill next year. So there's an opportunity, there's a vehicle there already made for it to happen, and I've contacted the Department of Health and I've contacted the Department for Communities to say, look, let's have this conversation. Now, so far, Doug, maybe you'll have a word with Robin. The Department of Health have been a bit reluctant to get engaged. They're saying, look, it's not therapy, we don't fund it, it's nothing to do with us. But I think it is, because I think the policy around healthcare, and it does masquerade as healthcare, and the regulation of things that masquerade as healthcare, health has a role in doing that. And I think it would be important that we make it really clear this is not healthcare, this is not sanctioned therapy of any kind, this is torture. And it actually is preying on the most vulnerable people. It's preying on people who are already conflicted about who they are, and instead of encouraging them to be proud of who they are and to have the confidence and the courage to be themselves, it's actually twisting that back on them to make them feel even more guilty and ashamed. So I think we need to stop with conversion therapy. I mean, I have to say that I had this debate internally for a long time as to whether or not you can ban adults from doing things that are harmful, because at the end of the day, will they not just go and do it anyway? But I do think it's important actually that we ban this to make a public statement about where society stands on this therapy, that we don't believe that it's appropriate, that people shouldn't be accessing it. And I think if we take that stand and we make our position clear, it's a lot easier then to stop people being able to hawk this around different church halls and different organisations as though it's something that's beneficial to people's lives. It really isn't. And I think we just need to be honest and open about that, say it's not acceptable and ban it. And I'm up for that if other ministers are willing, who have the policy lead, to do the policy lead work on it. I'm happy to have a justice vehicle take it forward.
I'm going to go to Emma next, because as Naomi said, that those communities and health are both involved in taking forward what would be any legislation banning conversion therapy. Where does your party stand on this, and is there a will within them to introduce legislation to ban this kind of practice?
Well, Sinn Féin party policy is opposed to conversion therapy. Now, I know it's Carol's understanding that it is a health issue. Funny, I was talking to Mickey Murray yesterday, and
this is just so our assembly, because I asked him.
We're not going to bat it round, though. We're going to work together.
We're going to pass it up to Doug right after you, but first of all.
Well, I've written to Robin Swan about it. I know that Mickey, Naomi's colleague in Alliance, has started an online petition to Robin Swan about it. And I don't know if Carol went back to your letter or not, but I was talking to her the other day about it, and definitely there's role within Sinn Féin to ban it. So if there's some box that has to be ticked within communities, that'll not be an issue, because we are opposed to it. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of it's a thing to, when you change a law or you legalize something or you outlaw something, that's the one step. But in terms of changing attitudes, it takes more than just that. And this is one of the funny ones, in that by outlawing this, you then start to change attitudes. So people believe that it's acceptable to treat gay people as if they're criminals, as if they're doing something wrong, as if they're mentally unwell, which is not the case. And allowing that role, or allowing that perception to be perpetuated, is wrong and damages further the LGBT community, and it allows them to be othered. I know, similar to Pete, I'm from a rural community. South Armagh and South Derry aren't that different. And I know that we had an issue a couple of weeks ago in Marfelt, about 8 miles from where I'm from, where we had a couple of evangelicals go door to door with letters encouraging people to avail of conversion therapy, and very unashamed in boasting about what they had done and had their names on the letter. And from my perspective, as somebody who, I mean, I'm 28 now, I know that Catholic school hasn't changed that much since I left, who went through Catholic education for 14 years and had sex education that never mentioned homosexuality, consent, healthy relationships, any of those things that we should be discussing with young people. If I think about, you know, someone in their early adolescent years receiving a letter like that through the post, somebody that's potentially struggling with their sexuality or unsure or doesn't know who to turn to in terms of who they can talk to or who they can, you know, find information from. The impact of that, and we talked earlier about mental health and the problems that would lead to for someone's mental health, doesn't bear thinking about. And it's not something that should be accepted or something that we should turn a blind eye to. So from Sinn Féin's perspective, very clearly we're opposed to conversion therapy, and if there's something that we can do to ban it, absolutely we'll do that.
Doug, I'm going to go to you, because obviously it's been passed on that this is, you know, it would be an issue for Robin Swan if someone is passing something off as a treatment when it isn't. If it was someone claiming to be able to, you know, treat cancer by some voodoo means, there would be steps taken to prevent that person from doing it. And yet in this case, it seems perfectly acceptable for someone to tell someone who is gay that they have an illness that needs cured, and pass that off as some kind of healthcare. But as Emma said, there's attitudes that need to be changed here, and there's also the problem too that if you ban it, it would have to be, the penalties would have to be appropriate so as not to push it underground. So if people didn't continue to do this, that there would have to be proper sanctions to wipe it out completely and change people's attitude within those very strong faith communities against this kind of thing. Is it something else you already have spoken about? I know that we've had a pandemic, but we're at the end of that now. It's time to try and go back to ordinary business and trying to get the other outstanding issues sorted. Is it something that you have spoke about within internally as party?
Well, conversion is hateful and it's harmful and it should be banned. Absolutely, it should be banned. It is not healthcare in any shape or form. Quite the opposite. It damages the health. It damages the mental health. I think we're all agreed here. The argument of whether or not the Department for Health take the lead on something that's not healthcare is an argument I suppose we all have. What I believe, and I think Nomi's right here, is there's something that the executive needs to do as a collaboration to stop this and to ban this. Have we had discussions about it within the Ulster Unionist Party? Yes, we have had discussions about it, and I think we're all agreed that this is not healthcare in any shape or form. And I think the sooner we can bring forward any form of legislation that can ban it from taking place and make sure that we put measures in place to stop it happening, even underground, as you've quite rightly said. I think we all need to do that, and that's the Department for Justice, Communities and Health, and maybe even others need to be involved in that as well, because there's no benefits to this in our society whatsoever. And I think that's clear. It's nearly one of those questions when somebody asks you and you look at them to say, are you really asking me that question? But clearly there are people out there who think it's acceptable. Well, it's absolutely not acceptable. I take your point that we're coming out of a pandemic, but there are capacity issues, I honestly believe, within the Department for Health in trying to get healthcare back on an even keel following this pandemic. That's not to say that every other issue should be set aside. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that there is a capacity. They do have to prioritize certain things. But I think this is a conversation that must be had within the executive with all of the political parties. And I think it's a debate as well that we need to have in the Assembly, because what we really need to do is we need to find out where MLAs stand in regards to issues like this. And that takes people standing up and being forthright and explaining their position on that. And then we'll know where the issues really lie in regards to this. And if it's going to be blocked, if it's going to be stalled, if it's going to be held in the long grass, then we need to find out who it is. And I think it's always very easy just to say, well, it's all the DUP's fault. And I'm not saying it's not, but we need to find out where it's being held up. For the Department for Health, I think there's a capacity issue just at this moment in time. But I'm hoping that capacity will increase in the coming months, and we might see some movement in this in the months to come.
It is. Pete, I'm going to go to you, but it is true. When we have these debates publicly, it's a good opportunity to see who the person you vote for and where they stand on these issues, because I have heard people stand up and speak about certain subjects and thought, my goodness, I didn't know that was what you thought about X, Y, or Z. In relation to conversion therapy and your party, this is also very damaging to people's mental health. And what I would also say is, as a journalist, I've reported on court cases where so-called experts who are involved in this kind of conversion therapy have been rolled out in court cases to speak as experts for the defence in relation to other issues. And there's an issue there with the practicing licences of these people and how they are allowed to practice and go forward and be put forward as experts when this is how they're making their money, you know, on the side by basically ruining people's lives. Pete, where does your party stand in relation to conversion therapy? Have you had a discussion about this?
Yep.
And any plan as to how you're going to push this forward to finally rid our society of it?
Yep, we've had a discussion about it in the last couple of weeks also, and I know Mark H. Dorkin was had stuff out in the press last year, and we completely backed the banning of conversion therapy. And I mean, I'd go further than what we're talking about, actual physical practices. We need to address the counselling part of it and the religious counselling and what's called talk therapy and stuff like that, because it's those what people see as more subtle, and that's probably what was behind the tweet of, and I'm not defending Boris Johnson here, but when he put out the tweet calling for a debate, I mean, it was shocking to call for a debate and conversion therapy, but the rolling back from that and the subsequent statement that was put out afterwards was trying to put a bit of distance between the physical practices and then still allowing the certain religious counselling if people want to go and seek help. And that angers me, because it's those sort of subtle things that when you're growing up, I mean, the amount of people that had said among my family that how come it was Pete out of House of Five Boys that ended up being gay, and the line that's trotted out is because my mum always asked me to help her with the cooking, you know, and that's the small attitudes that my mum was always helped me or asked me to help with the cooking, and that's true because I love cooking. But I mean, it's those small attitudes that there's something that triggered it. There's something that triggered your sexuality, and when people have that in their heads, and in urban areas that's being dispelled quicker. In rural areas like South Armagh, it takes a longer period of time for people to realise that nothing triggers your sexuality. So if you can get out of your head, and that's where education comes from when you're growing up and you're building your views and your relationships in school, where you need to talk about LGBT families and different relationships so that people understand that it is not a choice, it's not something that was triggered and therefore cannot be fixed or counselled. And so I think that's what needs to be addressed going forward. I mean, some of the practices that the physical practices that's been talked about over the last couple of weeks since this tweet from Boris Johnson are horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And there's nobody probably in the Assembly that would back them. But I do fear that we're trying to make a bit of space for so-called religious counselling. And I'll be at the front of the queue shouting that down. But yes, it's going to be heard on the floor of Westminster, the debate, because of the signatures from the petition. And I'd like to see it heard on the floor of the Assembly as well, because we need to make a move on this.
Anthony, what happened in the South was when they had the referendum is that we got a chance to talk about all these things, and people talked about them within families and within homes, and we seen, you know, all the wee conversations people had with their granny and their granda. We didn't have that because obviously Westminster ended up having to legislate for same-sex marriage here. So in some ways we missed out on that middle bit, the part where we do talk to elderly relatives and do talk to maybe people who have grown up in very rural communities, and we are mainly a rural society, to try and explain that, but we skipped that part out. And to think in relation to something like conversion therapy, or, you know, what people might call, you know, religious counselling, or any sort of other name you want to dress it up as, that this is a chance now for us to have that debate that we missed out on during the same-sex marriage debate.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't so much support a debate on this issue, because I don't think we need a debate on this issue anymore. I think this issue has to be put to bed once and for all. It's been clamoring around for the past number of years now, as basically as a dead cat. You know, we know that conservative organisations have been using this so-called conversion therapy as a way to try and keep on the agenda that queer people and LGBT people are still a mental health issue to be dealt with, and that is absolutely not the case. And we need to make sure that we say in all forms of government and in any way, walk of life, that it is unacceptable. It needs to be banned. Look, the LGBT action plan that was published in 2018 under Theresa May's government, they found that 2% of those respondents had actually been actively engaged within this process, and that's a very significant portion of our population who have had to undergo these horrendous and horrific conversion therapies. You know, we do know, I'm sure all of the panelists know of the one organisation that comes to mind in terms of Northern Ireland that still operate under this guise of healthcare. You know, and I think across this panel here, we have a political consensus on this anyway. You know, we've heard that the minister is trying to push it back based on capacity issues, but the issue and the debate is done. It just needs to be legislated for. This issue needs to be put to bed. No one wants to see it anymore. Look, it was the very first thing that I brought, a very first motion that I brought whenever I joined the Green Party back in 2014 to our party conference the following year, and it was unanimously supported by all party members, because of course we would get rid of something as dangerous and damaging as this, and I look forward to it being absolutely taken out of all Northern Ireland society as well. And I know that it's happening in Republic as well, because I know Emma's colleague Fintan Warfield has brought it through the Seanad there as well, so that needs to be finalised too. So it's completely gone within the whole island of Ireland.
Fiona, obviously that leads into healthcare, mental health care, all the other things that come along with that, which we started this year talking about the mental health crisis that existed within Northern Ireland. That got pushed aside with the pandemic, but I mean, I've often, you know, said when I've been speaking or writing, that didn't just disappear. That mental health crisis still exists. It still exists very much. We know from studies that have been done and from groups who work with people, especially young people within the LGBTQ community, that mental health is a real issue. We have a couple of questions, both on a similar theme from people who are watching. Alicia McGowan has said trans healthcare services have been at a standstill now, and waiting lists have not moved in around 2 years. This is causing mental health issues for already vulnerable people and forcing people into expensive private care, self-medication, and putting lives at risk. When will this be sorted out? And we have a very similar question from Karen Linesay, who's saying, why is Ireland North and South such a basket case when it comes to access to proper and timely healthcare for trans people? Why do trans people have to suffer years of mental and physical pain because of an inability to organise what are basic healthcare services? I have been doing this event for a number of years, and I seem to have asked that question every year, but nothing seems to have changed in relation to not just funding and proper access, but proper and appropriate healthcare for the trans community. Your party is obviously, this is something that all parties will have had to take notice of. What will you be doing to try and push this issue forward in this coming administration?
Absolutely, and I think it's stark on that issue in particular. I think, and you say you've asked it every year that you've done this. I remember being asked last year. It's stark, I think, on this issue in particular because of the kind of figures that you see, that there hasn't been any movement. And it's exactly like you said with mental health during the pandemic. Mental health cases during the pandemic didn't just stop, they surged. And the waiting lists, though the waiting lists aren't being alleviated within trans healthcare, that's not the only problem, they're growing. So at the minute we have hundreds of people who've been on that list for years, who, as you say, are either And it's kind of like the issue of abortion on this one, funny enough, either being forced to choose private healthcare, which creates a class dynamic because not everybody can afford private healthcare. And we have to remember, particularly when we're talking about these kind of things, that austerity cuts, underfunding disproportionately affect those from minoritized backgrounds and communities as well. So there's a double burden on this. And I think it is stark that there has been absolutely no change. And I think that it's a disgrace, to be quite frank. It's not just the healthcare that we need funding for, and quite frankly, a complete overhaul of. And I think that people should look to groups like Transgender NI, who have done an incredible job through people like Alexa Moore, at actually designing how this system of healthcare from trans people can look like. We met with Transgender NI informally at the beginning of the recent assembly, and were asked if we could lobby the health minister to get them in the door. I don't think that should be a thing. I think the door should be open to members from the trans community, especially those who are advocating on specific issues of healthcare, especially when we have such a damning system that leads people to a situation where, you know, and anybody can look this up, the attempted suicide rates for young trans people here and in other countries where there is absolutely no excuse for underfunding in healthcare anywhere, but particularly in places where it so detrimentally affects people's healthcare. I'm glad to see that the Minister for Health said that he will meet with trans groups, but only when all of the reports have come back on what the healthcare system for trans people is like. I don't know why we're waiting. I think that this is something that should absolutely be at the top of the list because of the detrimental impact that it's having on people. And I think you're right. It's not just a healthcare, it's wider than that. It has to be holistic. It has to be mental health as well. And it has to be sex education in schools, and starting this from a very young age. It's not good enough that I'm the same age as Emma. And she said that this is particularly bad in rural communities. Well, I come from the big smoke, as it's referred to, in rural communities. I'm the same age as her. And yet in almost the heart of Belfast in school, I was taught about abortion and sexuality in religion class. It's not good enough anymore. It's not good enough that groups like Precious Life are paraded into schools to teach kids that homosexuality, that being trans, that getting an abortion and all of these things are wrong, because it adds to the stigma, it adds to the mental health problems, and really I think a holistic approach which targets all of those is necessary 10 years ago. So we really need to get the foot on the pedal on this one.
And I'm going to go to you because, as I said, I have, there are questions that we've asked, and previously it would have been in relation to same-sex marriage. We now have an issue where that legislation is passed. There's still work to be done there, but in relation to the question for trans access to healthcare, for proper funding for that healthcare, for proper mental health treatment in relation to people who are suffering, it is distressing to think that there are people who are self-medicating who, are left in that position where they don't know where they're going to go. They're on a waiting list that seems to never move. And that's the one thing that hasn't changed. So I'd like to think, and I am a positive person, that we have progressed and our society has got better. But in relation to this issue, apparently it hasn't. It came to, we're at a standstill and people are left suffering on waiting lists with nothing being done in relation to this. Your party's a very strong position within the executive to lobby the health minister, and not only to lobby, and also any other departments that can help in relation to funding for and access to this. What is it that you are doing in relation to helping people to move on the issue in trans rights?
Well, trans healthcare, and I suppose someone had mentioned there Finton's bill in terms of conversion therapy, and I know he's done an awful lot of work in terms of trans healthcare as well, but the 26 counties, I suppose on most of these progressive issues, the 26 counties is a good bit ahead of us. And so we have already got a self-declaration model in the 26, which we don't have in the north. People who are trying to get trans healthcare here are treated as if they're mentally unwell, and that's not acceptable. The issues with the Breckenburn Clinic, again, I've written to Robin Swan about that, but those issues, in fairness, existed long before Robin took on the mantle as the health minister. You've people that literally their healthcare stopped 4 years ago, and they're waiting ever since. And when we're talking about mental health and people's well-being and emotional well-being, and particularly young people coming up, and struggling with these questions and not having anywhere to go or anyone to talk to about how they progress, and someone that identifies as another sex, how they move on that, it's not good enough. And the figures speak for themselves in terms of suicide attempts from young people and the lack of counselling services. But from our perspective, we want to see, it's our party policy, we want to see self-declaration model, we want to see people, we want to see the fact that people have to go through a panel of medical and legal experts. That's degrading, it's dehumanizing, it's wrong, it's like Capita dealing with people at PIP appeals. It's inhumane. It shouldn't be happening in 2020. It shouldn't have been happening in 2010. And I would echo everything that Fiona has said there. I know that from my own experience in a rural area, you find an awful lot of ignorance, and I think that a lot of these issues, people feel that there isn't widespread support on the ground, but it's because people maybe they're not personally affected by something like this, and therefore they don't think that there's any issue. So whenever marriage equality was granted, people thought, right, well sure, what are the gays complaining about? They can get married now. That's not the case. There are still so many issues there. There are still so many rights that haven't been won, and there's still such inequality and discrimination that people face. And it's about breaking down those barriers and communicating to people and educating people about the fact that someone who's growing up in the north of Ireland in 2020 as a young LGBT person doesn't have the same rights as their hetero friends, and how we deal with that. Trans is definitely one of the big issues that needs
I can see you,
to be
Kate, trying to get in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is one of the issues that really, really frustrates me, because the very first time I sat on a panel for Newry Pride, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, this was raised as a question from the audience, and I had to put my hands up and say, listen, I know next to nothing as a gay man, I know next to nothing about the inadequacies in trans healthcare, but I guarantee I'll go away from this meeting and I will do my damnedest to address these issues. There doesn't seem to be the urgency out there. I mean, every single meeting since we set up in Newry Down in the health working group, I have raised this question. I've been given the stats back. I've been speaking to the chief executives of the Southern and Southeastern Trust. It's been raised at a meeting of all the chief executives. It was first of all passed off as a Belfast Trust. It's not our area, although it's the only gender identity clinic Brackenburn for Northern Ireland. But the waiting lists are astonishing. I think there's over 400 people on the waiting list, and it hasn't moved. And a year into trying to push this issue forward and getting nowhere, a neighbour of mine 2 doors down that I actually taught maths to, a young fella in my estate who had transitioned, when it was in front of me in a real life experience, I mean, it opened my eyes to some of the issues. And when you're talking about mental health, this person had sat on the list for 2 years for an initial assessment. I mean, it's not good enough. Questions or answers coming back saying we had no assembly, which is now morphed into a pandemic, and we've other issues to deal with. We cannot keep pushing this down the line, because if we're going to refer to mental health and the spike in mental health after this pandemic in the next couple of months, we need to address the crisis in mental health in trans healthcare. His parents, or her parents now, sorry, had to drive to Cork for private treatment. The strain that it put on her parents was enormous, and it brought home to me the total inadequacies here. But I have to say that there is absolutely no urgency in the Department of Health. I do respect that the Minister of Health is carrying out a review and will meet with the trans groups after that review is tabled. But I do fear again that it will be masked by the coronavirus and pushed down the road, and we won't deal with this until it's twice as bad in the future. What I would like to see finally just on this is that there is some alternative arrangements for those that are on the waiting lists. You cannot leave people sitting on waiting lists for ever and a day, with no access to any treatment. Some people don't have pockets deep enough in order to go and access the treatment themselves. People are self-medicating, and people are actually forced to crowdfund for surgical treatments. I mean, it is inhumane.
I'm going to go to you, Doug, because we're saying here and there that Drumswan has agreed, and I'm getting, have a message that they agreed to meet with trans groups, but only after there's a review. What would be the harm in the minister meeting with these groups now without any preconditions? and listening to their issues. Surely the more informed he is about these issues, the better the response that's going to be. Why would there have to be preconditions in relation to a meeting with trans lobby groups?
I don't think there's any to be honest with you, Alison. I think there's some fundamental problems in that. Is that you can have a meeting with as many people as you want, and you can sit and you can listen to the issues that they have, and there are many and they are varied. But if you don't then give them something, if there's not something, at least a direction that you're going, then you're having a meeting and raising hopes for very little payback for them having coming in, because what they want is not people talking to them, not people taking notes, but people who are going to take action in order to address the issues that they have. I met with Alexa Moore a number of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, and had a conversation with her. And I've met Alexa on a number of occasions, and I had a conversation with her just about how things were. And it's absolutely horrendous what they're going through. The clinic, the clinic is called, what's it called? Brackenburn?
Brackenburn.
Yeah, Brackenburn. Yeah, the clinic, I mean, it's working on a one in, one out process at the minute. So nobody is getting seen, and that's not helpful in any shape or form. And if people aren't given a bit of hope that they're going to be seen, then their mental health is just going to suffer more. And that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing their mental health degrading on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis. I mean, the review on gender identity services, which was started before the pandemic, I think has been stalled because of the pandemic, and it's about to start up again and bring forward recommendations. But those recommendations can't be about kicking it into the long grass. Those recommendations must give us a clear gender identity strategy that helps these people and helps them with their mental health and helps them transition, or comes up with alternative ways of doing this. And they do it far better down in the Irish Republic than we do up here in Northern Ireland. And I think we need to look to our nearest neighbour and take best practice from them. But mental health is at an epidemic level throughout Northern Ireland, not just within the LGBTQ community, but throughout Northern Ireland. A friend of mine committed suicide 3 weeks ago. A young man, a fit young man, and he took his life due to mental health issues. A week ago, another friend of mine attempted to take his life. This issue is out there at every single corner. And of course, the LGBTQ community feel it a little bit more acutely because their community has been largely forgotten over such a long period of time. But it is a serious issue. I'm hoping that Robin appointing the mental health champion can try to address some of these issues. It's not just about mental health. There's education that has to be brought into this, because we need to start teaching at a very early level to try and counter an awful lot of what is being said. So there's a huge strategy that we have to look at this. It's a cross-cutting strategy, and every department has a voice in that. And Robin, of course, is going to have to lead it, and he does have to lead it. And eventually, this review has to end, and we have to come up with a strategy, and we have to start implementing that strategy, and that strategy needs to be resourced. But right now, I feel we're letting the community down. I think we're letting them down badly, and we have done for many years now.
Naomi, I'm gonna come to you, but I'm gonna sort of widen this out. Maria Hassan has sent in a question saying sex education in Northern Ireland is failing our young people, particularly LGBTQ plus young people, regardless of a school's ethos or the religion or moral views of staff and parents. Every pupil should have access to relevant, inclusive and objective information on sex and relationships, as is their right. And we know that specifically, some schools are very, very good at dealing with children who are transitioning and making sure that's as comfortable as possible, but some are still found badly wanting when it comes to that. But in general, the sex education in our schools, I mean, we've heard both Emma and Fiona, who are a hell of a lot younger than I am, talking about how inadequate it was when they were at school. When I was at school, we brought into a room and shown a video about rabbits, and that was it. That was some photos.
Well, you're lucky. You're lucky because friends of mine got the Mayfly video and they all die immediately after they have sex. So it's not kind of the message you want to send young people.
No, well, I always say I was pregnant at 17, and I blame that on the nuns who showed me a video of rabbits. So what else I meant to know.
The thing is, in my school, you did better than me, because in my school, because I didn't study biology for A level, I didn't study it above third year. I never had any sex education, none. Like, so,
it's just that you just assume that things are better now than they were, and we know that in some schools they're really crying, but in some there's nothing being done.
But there are much wider implications of this in terms of how society approaches healthy relationships, in terms of how we approach things like sexual assault and rape, consent, all of those issues, because they're not being taught in school in an age-appropriate way, and in a non-judgmental environment. I mean, schools, I understand there's an awkwardness. Teachers feel awkward talking to their pupils about sex, and they often get kind of a bit stressed about it. So they kind of farm it out and bring organizations in. Those organizations, for example, will often come from a position of abstinence because they're often religious-based organizations. Yeah. So they'll come and they'll tell people what to do not to have sex, but they're not really telling people how to approach a healthy sex life as an adult person making those healthy choices. And that's very difficult. And also there are experiences, and I mean, I've heard this from kids who've said, they put their hand up in the class, they kind of gathered up the courage to speak and said, I'm gay, what about me? And they said, oh, we don't deal with people like you. Now, that's not acceptable, because it should be education for everybody. And I do think that we need to, and I mean, it's something that I've raised with the education minister, we need non-judgmental, age-appropriate sex and relationship education throughout school. We can't presume that parents will do this, because we can't be sure that parents will feel either comfortable or be equipped to be able to have these conversations. We also can't assume that kids will simply learn from observing good behaviour, because we know if children are raised in homes where there's abuse or where there's coercion going on or whatever it might be, that they're not observing healthy relationships. So they need more than just watching what others do, and they can't rely on peer pressure, because we all know the stupid stuff you hear about sex when you're a teenager in school, and like none of it is useful and none of it is helpful, and none of it actually promotes a healthy attitude. So I think we do need to tackle this, and it's not about religion or not religion. People can still make their own faith choices about abstinence and other things. Having information doesn't mean you're going to do something, but it means that you're equipped when it comes to the point of decision making, that you're actually educated and able to make those decisions. And I think that it has to be inclusive, because if it isn't inclusive, then it's not really serving the whole population. And to me, relationship and sex education is one of those areas of school, a bit like how to run your finances, that kind of gets us a quick touch at one point in the year, and everybody moves on. And actually, these are the fundamentals of being an adult, able to have autonomy over yourself and be able to look after yourself, being able to care for yourself. And you should spend an awful lot more time in school dealing with those things than all the stuff we learn at school and forget as soon as we walk out the door. So I think it's really important. I also think that the issues around gender recognition and trans issues, I think those are going to be our next challenge. And I'm finding that it's trans people who are being denigrated and demonized. It's as though, if you like, people can accept the LGB and then they get to T and they stop and they can't cope with that. And this is the new kind of horror that people are using, and we're getting all of the same kind of negativity, scare stories, smears that we had about homosexual men. Now we have it about trans women, we have it about trans men, that they're predators, that they're dangerous and all of this. They are not, and we need to break those barriers down, and we need to start talking sense about some of these things. I mean, I was in the States, in Canada, on holiday a few years ago, and the amount of time dedicated on news programs debating toilets, and who could use which toilets and which changing rooms. We went into a tiny restaurant. It had 2 toilets, just single cubicles, and they just had on the door of both of them, whatever. no, like men and women, it was whatever. And I thought, there's a simplicity about that. People overcomplicate these issues because they're looking for reasons to exclude people. It's not because it can't be done. It's a lack of thoughtfulness, and to me, a lack of carefulness around how people approach trans issues. When I was in Westminster, I was involved with a campaign to try to change passports so that people wouldn't have to have their gender on a passport, because I think, again, you can imagine how difficult that is for somebody who, going through security, as a woman, being kind of looked at strangely by whoever's checking their passport, because their passport's given them their gender assigned at birth. And that, to me, that's a small change. It makes no difference to security. It makes no difference to anyone but the person carrying the passport. But it makes a massive difference to them in terms of their dignity and respect. And I think we need to look at this more, rather than people, the way it has become, I think, a very negative and confrontational debate about people's identity. We need to look at this about what it is to treat other people with respect and dignity. And treating other people as equals with respect and dignity doesn't diminish any of us in who we are. Or in our
the toilet situation debate.
Yeah.
And also the debate that this isn't somehow feminism. And, as a feminist, I can assure you this is not feminism.
It's not feminism.
There are many men in my life, in many places where I've felt in danger and harassed. And never once has it been at the hands of a trans woman. It has always been at the hands of a man. Do you know what I mean? It would never be. And there obviously not children running around nightclubs in the 90s, but you didn't have to worry about whose toilet it was, as long as it was.
And I have
literally. Oh, sorry. Can I go to I just want to ask.
I just want to mention one tiny thing about schools, and it was an experience that I think was a positive one, which I think shows the changes in society. One of my friends who's a teacher, they had a young person who transitioned between 5th form and 6th form, and they said that when they wrote to parents to explain for the pupils who were in the class what would be happening, how it would be handled, to kind of avoid any awkwardness. And they said some of the parents were a bit concerned, some of the teachers were a bit nervous. They were worried that the pupil might end up being bullied or whatever, rejected. They said the experience was amazing because the young people just embraced it. And for them, this was just, okay, you're now who you are. We recognize and respect that. You're part of our group. And they had no issues, no complaints, nothing, because the young people's connection with the human being far outweighed whether they were presenting as a boy or a girl in school. For them, it was their friend back at school, and that was all that mattered. That's a positive story to kind of counterbalance a lot of what I think is very negative stuff that we often hear in the press and the media. And I think it feeds a kind of mania around this stuff, which doesn't reflect how the majority of people would treat an individual trans person if they had the opportunity.
And my children are, one of them is in their early 20s and had a similar situation at school, and it just was not an issue. It was not an issue at all. Yeah. It was, and I think that you could learn a lot from how young people deal with the issues that some of us in who are older try to make into something that isn't. Anthony, we're never talking about how everybody's sex education was at school. How was your sex education at school? And what do you think that we need to do to make sure there's a uniform policy and the children are given the same rights and advice in relation to all aspects of their sexuality and protecting themselves as well in relation to consent and all sorts of other things?
I mean, to be honest, I can't really remember much of my sex education at all in school. I went to an all-boys school, all boys Catholic secondary school, and it was, it was non-existent. One thing I do remember was learning about abortion services, and that was in the context of a particular organisation that was invited into the school, and we were brought out and shown a video of how horrible it was, and we were told to write up our own little sort of issue paper on it. Now you've been shown this video of how horrible it is, tell us what you think about it. And that was the only education that I got on those sorts of issues. Look, I think Naomi went through some of the really important stuff in terms of relationship and sex education. The only thing I would add really is that the education system in this country needs to be, in terms of queer education, needs to be based on the lived experiences of queer people. That includes history. The 1980s, when we look back, was a horrible time in our recent period in terms of queer people. We lost an entire generation of activists, an entire generation of people because of obviously the AIDS epidemic, but the lack of government response to that, and it took well over 30, 40 years to see real positive change. And now those sorts of issues and healthcare for that has moved on so much since then, and it's now not a death sentence. But you see the response to that, and I would like to see that sort of history taught to kids in school so that they know where we came from and what actually happened. But apart from that, also in terms of what positive relationships are in queer instances, we were never taught how to actually properly have a relationship and how to live in a loving and healthy relationship in either sense, and not just queer people. And I think that sort of stuff needs to be included as well. But we'll go back to in terms of trans healthcare. I mean, the only thing I would add really to it, because we know in terms of Brackenburg Clinic and some of those issues there, transgender NI, if anyone hasn't seen the policy paper that they put out, which was the future of trans healthcare, you need to read it, and you need to have it in every single executive member's board or desk, just to keep it there. And this is what the sector organisations are telling you is happening, and this is how you get out of it. So please do it. And it's up to us to try, and it's particularly us in the backbenchers, to try and make sure that is always kept on the agenda. And just one more thing I would add, we've seen last month it was reported in a number of national newspapers in terms of the Conservative Party in Britain are looking to roll back on trans health or on trans issues, trans rights issues. That absolutely needs to be called out and cannot be allowed to happen. If they dare roll back on any of these issues, there needs to be a serious taken to the streets. There needs to be a serious implications for them if they dare go back in terms of the Gender Recognition Act and any other issues.
Pete, I'm going to go to you as well. I'm not sure, what was the sex education like down your neck of the woods when you were in school?
Shocking, absolutely shocking. I went to an all boys school, but it was a Christian brother school. And I remember the pastoral care that we had for the first 5 years. From the start, everybody, probably myself, Anthony, your sexuality when you're in secondary school. What I found is I didn't see myself, I didn't want to ask questions, and I become more reserved. I was extremely quiet in school because I didn't want to speak out about things like that. So I felt I was more isolated, and I don't think it has changed much in the school that I went to over the last 20 years. I left school 20 years ago this summer. I think one of my biggest memories was the ex-principal, who was a Christian brother, who was quite radical and quite good crack. Had said at assembly when we were in 7th year before going to college, anybody, because there was homophobic verbal abuse going on with a couple of kids in the school, anybody who's thinking of coming out, I'm going to give you a bit of advice. He said this to the whole assembly hall: don't, until you get to university. You're safer there. And those words really stuck with me. Not that I was actually going to get up and go out, there were not in a million years would I have, but I didn't right through university. And it was to 24 before I then give out, because I sort of then retreated back further. So I think it's quite damaging. Cara Friend has done a lot of work with schools with the Inclusive School Pilot Programme. They came to Crossing Glen School there in March, and they done the shout out for bullying. It was extremely effective, and it was engaging the young people into discussing LGBT issues and bullying. And I have to say that there isn't the same rigour for homophobic bullying as there is for other forms of bullying. And I mean, that goes between pupil and teacher and teacher and pupil and pupil and pupil together. I know of a situation where a certain teacher who's only out of, only qualified, it's severe homophobic bullying and the failure to clamp down on that just creates a huge issue among those LGBT kids that sit in that classroom. They will become like and completely isolated. And I think the school need to clamp down a lot more on that. There is the underreporting of bullying as well. But I mean, when you talk, and Naomi's right, when you talk to kids, there is no issue there. And I think we need to get away from it being in the hands of the school and the Board of Governors to dictate what their sex education entails. I think we need to talk about all different families and all different relationships and equip people with the information. Fully agree with Naomi, it's a great line, I'm going to steal it. Having the information doesn't mean you're going to do it, So it hasn't changed much over the last 20 years, but there needs to be an onus on everybody in political life to put pressure on schools. Some schools, you said, Alison, are very, very good. Some just
some I know. I mean, my daughter's school was really good, and they had a society and everything, and it was I think that there was a lot of support, but that was more people led than it was teachers led. That was what the people wanted.
And the other, a very brief comment. The other thing, through our youth club, I was chairing the youth club just after the school for a couple of years, and we run a 4-week program with Cara Friend as well on LGBT and relationship and issues and stuff. And at the start, it was very cagey. The young people didn't want to talk about it, and there was a few jabes thrown out and the whole lot. But a lot of stereotypes were broken down whenever we get into the 4 weeks of it. And you're right, people had the relationships with the person. But yes, they had certain stereotypes because there was no broad conversation about it. You know, people were afraid to talk about these issues. When you talk about it and get it out in the open, you can break down stereotypes.
I think we're sort of coming to an end now. Doug, I'm going to go to you. I think when you were at school, was it, I'm assuming that they still had like slate and all that there kind of thing? You would have, what was it? You were at school, was it candlelight and then slate?
It's as well this is socially distanced, Alison.
Yeah. Alison, I don't have an interesting story to tell you, unfortunately, because I was never in a school any longer than 2 years in my whole life. From the age of 6 onwards, I was moving around England, Scotland, Wales, Germany, Gibraltar, Northern Ireland. So I never stayed anywhere. And I'm going to be really honest. I do not remember one single lesson around sexual education. Not one. And I think back to my children growing up in Scotland and the school they went to in Scotland, and my daughter who had a friend who was a young lad who was gay as well. And I remember her coming home and saying how badly he was bullied at school. But again, they got no relationship or LGBT sort of training or teaching while in school either. So I've got to say it's widespread throughout the whole of the United Kingdom that this is not being addressed. But if we look at Northern Ireland, you can go to, and you've said it yourself, you can go to some schools and they're absolutely fantastic in their approach that they take. But then you can go to other schools that are so conservative that they don't touch it with a barge pole. And, you know, I think it's right to say that we need to take this out of the hands of the school and the Board of Governors, that this needs to be part of a directed curriculum. You know, and it's not there. And that's not saying it's a bad school because it doesn't do it. It's because it's a conservative school with a conservative Board of Governors who don't want to touch it. And that's the problem that we have here in Northern Ireland. And it's the maintained sector, it's the controlled sector, it's at every single level. And this is just too important an issue just to leave it down to the school to decide what they will and will not teach. Because bullying that starts at school can affect the person into young adulthood and way into later life. And we need to try and address that through education. But that's where we need it to be centralized, part of a mandated curriculum as to what they should or should not do in regards to this issue.
And as we come to close this to an end, it's obvious there's a circular, you know, entirety there when we look at everything that we have spoke about, and it all comes back. And then if we were teaching our children from a very young age about all aspects of life and how there's so many different kinds of families and, you know, so many different kinds of parents and so many different kinds of people in the world, that all the issues that we're talking about now would probably be a lot easier resolved when they get the adulthood and become in positions of authority and become politicians and become all sorts of other things. Listen, I want to thank you all. It's been lovely. I'm sorry you didn't all get to have a hug and have a proper chat and to get to see all the people asking the questions, but I'm delighted that so many people engaged with us and did ask such interesting questions. I want to thank Anthony Flynn from the Green Party, Pete Byrne from the SDLP, Emin Sheeran from Sinn Féin, Doug Beattie from the Ulster Unionist Party, Naomi Long, Alliance Party leader, and Fiona Ferguson from People Before Profit. I'm so sorry that the DUP aren't here, but we will keep on asking. And hopefully by next year, we will be free of this awful pandemic and we will all be back in one room again together. And maybe some of you will actually buy me a beer or something afterwards instead of...
She's downgraded from vodka. It was vodka.
We'll get you vodka.
Vodka is part of my payment from this. Yourselves, these lovely people, I will take any kind of payment from yourselves.
Hold your best.
I'm not a fussy one. Listen, thank you so much. It's been lovely speaking to you all. I hope that was a useful conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.